From time to time, people ask me to recommend some good, reliable introductions, some good books about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or how to combat atheism, and books about science. So, finally, getting round to doing that today. And I have several piles of books here on my desk, which I'm going to go through. I'm not going to link to them in the description below because there are so many, and they're all, as far as I'm aware, in print, so they're available to get if you wanted to read them. Now, this is just a small selection of literally thousands of books that one could recommend. These ones I have selected are written by acknowledged experts in the field, very distinguished scholars who are writing for a general audience mostly. Some of them are very thin, like this one here, and some of them are huge bricks, which you can even build a house with if you don't want to read them. But the first book I will tackle and recommend is this little red book. No, it's not Mao Zedong's thoughts. It is the Holy Bible, New Revised Standard Version. And it comes in other colours, not just red, apparently. Now, the NRSV, as it's called, is the gold standard in the academic world. If you're quoting from the Bible in English, scholars usually quote from this. It's the best translation around. There are many good translations, but this one, for various reasons, is seen as the gold standard. There is one translation, in my view, to avoid, and that's the King James Version. In its day, 400 years ago, it was great. But since then, the English language, has evolved and changed, so we're not always understanding really what it means, because the English language has a different meaning quite often. Also, we have very much older manuscripts of the Greek text now, so we're better informed about what the text said, at least going back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which the authors of the King James Version didn't have. So I don't recommend that version. So, coming on to the other books, if you want a good general introduction to Judaism, I recommend this book, A History of Judaism by Martin Goodman. He is Professor of Judaism at Oxford University, and this covers everything, basically from year dot all the way up to contemporary times. So he's looking at the origins of Israel, the formation of the Bible, talking about Jews in the Greco-Roman world, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, Zealots, etc. There's even a chapter on Paul and Jesus, all the way through to the medieval period, the Mishnah, the Talmud, etc. So this is a really good, solid, scholarly introduction. Certainly recommend that. If you want to study the Bible, this is the Jewish Bible, of course, not the New Testament, in greater depth, I recommend this, produced by the Jewish Publication Society, published by Oxford University Press. This is a showcase of some of the best Jewish scholarship in the world. And just give you a sense of what it looks like. So inside you have the text itself, the Torah, and then around the edges you have the commentary, the academic commentary. And what's interesting, I find, is to look up some of those favourite proof texts that Christians will come up with, say from Isaiah. You know, Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah dying for sins, isn't it? Okay, well, what do Jewish commentators say about that passage, and what have commentators in the past, how have they understood that passage, and many other passages? It will give you that answer in there. Now, if, like me, you're a complete idiot, you might want to get hold of The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Talmud by Rabbi Aaron Parry. He's an American rabbi. This is very readable, as you would expect, for complete idiots. It's got lots of little information boxes and tidbits, and very, very interesting, because Jews today tend to focus on the Talmud, not what the Christians call the Old Testament. So this includes the oral and written Torah, plus the later rabbinic commentaries and discussions on the text. So do recommend that. Very enjoyable read. So moving on from Judaism to Christianity, there is a single work that I would recommend if you want a really good reference work on the whole of Christianity, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church. It's been through many editions over the decades. And as I say, if you don't end up using it, you can always build a house with it. This is found on every bishop's bookshelf. Every priest has a copy of this, I would imagine. It's not fundamentalist. For example, The article on 2 Peter, the second letter of Peter in the New Testament, makes it clear that the evidence suggests very strongly, making it virtually impossible that the Apostle Peter wrote to Peter, and explains why, which means it's a forgery. So it is very honest, it's very good scholarship, the best single volume you can get on Christianity, in my view. What's a good book on the historical Jesus? Well, this one, The Historical Figure of Jesus by E.P. Saunders, who's an American professor, a specialist in this subject. If you want to understand why, for example, scholars don't ever use the Gospel of John when they are trying to understand the historical Jesus, this will explain why, what the problems are with the Gospel of John. If you want to understand Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you want to understand Jesus' Jewish context, how he saw God, what's made up in the New Testament, he'll explore that, and so on. Very, very good book. Recommend that. If you want a good history of the Bible, that's the Christian Bible, the New and the Old Testaments, you could do worse than get this. A History of the Bible, the book and its faiths, plural, by John Barton. I was privileged to have him on Blogging Theology a month or two ago. Lovely guy, professor of the Bible at Oxford. This is a fairly new one, and it will take you through, so the Old Testament, obviously, ancient Israel, its history, its language, talk about Christian beginnings, the letters, the Gospels, talk about biblical manuscripts, and how the Bible was interpreted in the medieval period, the Reformation, by rabbis, by Christians, and also what's happened to the Bible since the rise of biblical criticism, because there's been some pretty big shocking stories there, and my video with John Barton explains some of those issues, so really recommend that. It's on the Sunday Times best-selling list, so it's very popular work. Another book which I quite like is by Bart Ehrman, How Jesus Became God, the Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. Now, having read this book, I mean, virtually everything he says is pretty mainstream and standard scholarship. But because of his infamy or celebrity, because he's very, very active on social media, on YouTube, all over the place, he tends to be hated by very conservative Christians. But in fact, what he says is pretty mainstream. And he certainly explains an interesting fact that historically, there is no evidence that Jesus thought he was God, or his disciples. They didn't think he was God either. This was a later belief that emerged in certain areas of the church. And he gives you the historical evidence for that. So I recommend that book. For a really good introduction to the New Testament as a whole, a historical introduction to the early Christian writings, comes back again with this text. This is a standard undergraduate text. It's full of lovely, you can't really see it, lovely photographs, very readable, very popular with students, apparently, published by Oxford University Press. This is the 5th edition. There is a 6th. I think there may be a 7th. I'm not sure. I do recommend this if you want a good standard introduction to the New Testament. And likewise, Bart Ehrman has written this book on the Bible, a historical and literary introduction, much thinner, but it covers all of the books of the Bible from an historian's point of view, not from a position of faith, obviously. So moving on now to Islam. So you've got a friend who, who is a bright person, say they've got a degree, they want a good readable introduction, intelligent thinking person's guide to Islam. Who do I refer them to? There are many books for an intelligent reader, but this one, a recent work, is very good. A Thinking Person's Guide to Islam, The Essence of Islam in 12 Verses from the Quran by His Royal Highness Prince Ghazi bin Mohammed, an introduction by the King of Jordan. On the back, it's recommended by many of the great and the good, top academics, both Christian and non-Christian. I've read this and it's very good. I don't agree with everything he says when it comes to contemporary issues, but I'm not going to go there. But in terms of his introduction to Islam, I think it's very mainstream Sunni scholarship. So I recommend that. He's got, I think, at least 2 PhDs, professor of philosophy, very erudite man, and a readable introduction. So what about Hadith? So you want a really good introduction to Hadith, and I have no hesitation in recommending this book. Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World by Jonathan Brown, professor in America. On the back cover, the professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Oxford University, Christopher Melchert, writes, "This book far surpasses all previous introductory surveys. It is especially distinguished by its attention to Hadith scholarship throughout the Middle Ages, not just the age of the great collectors." This is an excellent book. This is a second edition. I do recommend that. Just quickly popping through some other books. This is also by Brown, called Muhammad, a very short introduction, published by Oxford University Press. Very slim volume. It looks at Muhammad both from the traditional Islamic view and also from the position of Western historical critical method. That's the standard methodology scholars in the West. And it does lead to diverging portraits on some issues. This is a very handy introduction. I'm actually reading this at the moment, Philosophy in the Islamic World, also a very short introduction by Peter Adamson, who's a professor in the subject. If you want a good survey of philosophy in the Muslim world and how it introduced various themes into Western philosophy, in Catholicism and so on, this is a really helpful book. Now, we've all heard from certain quarters that Muhammad is a warmonger. He is someone who just aggressive, was not a prophet of peace or tolerance. Ha ha. Actually, the historical evidence suggests he was. For example, this book by Juan Cole, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. It's been out a couple of years. This New York Times book review says it's very erudite and cutting edge. He uses the best historical scholarship, and he comes to the conclusion, he himself is a professor of history, he's a specialist in this in the early Islamic period. He comes to the conclusion that Muhammad was a prophet of peace and tolerance. Now, if you know anything about Western scholarship, you'll be interested to know what Fred Donner is a professor at University of Chicago, on the back here. He says Cole's Muhammad makes a convincing case, and Donner is one of the world's leading experts on Muhammad in the early, a convincing case for Muhammad as apostle of tolerance and peace. The fact is, Muhammad was a prophet of peace and tolerance. History backs that up, and this book will give you all the detailed scholarly research which leads an honest and objective inquirer to conclude that Muhammad was a prophet of peace, despite what certain missionaries will have you believe. Another book I really recommend, sorry, there are too many, by Jonathan Brown, Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenge and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy. Excellent book. I'm not going to go into it now. This video is already going to be too long. He also wrote a book called Slavery in Islam, which is outstanding work. If you understand why, what's the relationship between Islam and slavery? Muhammad had slaves. What does that mean? What is slavery anyway? Brilliant book. Now, I should mention this actually. This is the Routledge Reader in Christian-Muslim Relations, edited by Mona Siddiqui. She's a professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Now, this is a compendium, collection of essays by academics on a range of subjects. I'll give you a flavour. For example, the first chapter is about John of Damascus. Now, if you know a bit about church history, you'll realise why he was so important. After the rise of Islam, he was the first major Christian commentator on Islam. So this chapter is John of Damascus, the heresy of the Ishmaelites. That's how he actually saw Islam, heresy of the Ishmaelites. Another chapter, the Islamic image of Paul and the origin of the Gospel of Barnabas. Another chapter on Muhammad and the Muslims in St. Thomas Aquinas. Very interesting chapter, I read that. And another one, Luther, his knowledge of and attitude towards Islam. Martin Luther, hugely important Christian figure in the Reformation. So what did he think about Muslims? What did he know about Islam? Very interesting. Another chapter, Islam and Christianity, diatribe or dialogue. Another one, the quest of the historical Muhammad. That's obviously mirroring the quest of the historical Jesus, and so on. So it's full of fascinating essays by leading experts, a Christian-Muslim reader, basically. Very useful to have on your bookshelf, I think. What else? Well, this is a good book. Love in the Quran by Prince Ghazi. Again, we've already seen another of his books. This rather thick book, this is the 7th edition. I think there's an 8th, maybe a 9th edition. Covers all aspects of love in the Quran, whether it be God's love for humanity, or people's love for God, or people's love for each other, in any and every sense. And it's covered in this masterful text, which is hugely popular. Fascinating resource. If Christians tell you that the God of Islam is not a God of love and doesn't love humanity, there is all the evidence and more that you could possibly want in this book. This is a book I'm currently reading, recommended to me by Usman Sheikh, who is coming on to Blogging Theology tomorrow to discuss his postgraduate research at Oxford University. This book by Nikolai Sinai is actually his supervisor at Oxford. He's professor of Islamic Studies and a fellow of Pembroke College, Oxford. Now, this is looking at the Quran from an historical critical view using Western methods. The author is what's called a neo-traditionalist, so he broadly accepts the Muslim understanding of the history of Islam with some caveats, but very interesting book. Talks about whether or not Muhammad existed, about Mecca, about whether the manuscripts of the Quran we have today go back to the time of Muhammad. Is it the same Quran? The answer is yes. Very interesting, and he critiques the revisionists, those who basically have a completely different version of Islamic origins. So do recommend that book. I've read about a third of it, and so far it has been really interesting. It's an advanced text. It's an undergraduate text for scholars and students. This book, before we come to atheism, this is the last book I recommend on the Abrahamic faith, The First and Final Commandment, A Search for Truth in Revelation Within the Abrahamic Religions by Lawrence B. Brown. On the back cover you can see that he's not Bartholomist in, I think it's Saudi Arabia he lives. He's actually a convert to Islam. But this is a very good book, actually, very readable. For example, he discusses monotheism in Judaism, Christianity and Islam, understanding of God, the doctrinal differences, whether it be with Jesus or the Trinity or the crucifixion, the books of Scripture, Old, New Testament, the Quran, the history of the Quran, evidences for the revelation of the Quran, and so on and so on. It's actually very readable, and I do recommend that book, although I'm not very keen on the cover, but you never judge a book by a cover, they say. Now, moving on finally to atheism. Now, there's a couple of recent books which I recommend. I'll start with this one. Now, this is hot off the press. This has just been published. Stephen Meyer, Return of the God Hypotheses, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Now, Meyer has a PhD from Cambridge University in the philosophy of science. That's his speciality. Now, he is a leading advocate of what is called intelligent design. This is controversial. If you go to the Wikipedia page, the article on ID, you will see in the first sentence or two, it says, intelligent design is a pseudo-science. So it's a fake science, it's not real science. That article says. Now, this is interesting because this book has many endorsements from leading scientists on the back, including a professor of physics at Cambridge University, who also happens to have a Nobel Prize in physics. He says about this book that this book demonstrates that intelligent design is credible science. Credible science. So the most leading distinguished practitioners of science, some of them, not all of them, are saying that this is actually now credible science. It's changing. Things are changing. And this has great reviews from not just physicists, but biochemists and other experts in the field, including one biologist who's also got a Nobel Prize in biology, obviously. So he talks about the Big Bang. I haven't read it all yet. He talks about design in nature and why basically science is now indicating very powerfully that design is very much present in whether it be the laws of physics or the biological machines we see in human cells. Everywhere we look, we are seeing exquisite design, complexity, engineering, which suggests mind. which is another word for God, of course. So I do recommend that. It's not easy reading. I mean, it is, full on science, but it is for the general reader. And lastly is this book, Islam Answers Atheism by ASRAR RASHID. Now, he's a British writer, Imam, I think, and this is actually a surprisingly good book. I say surprisingly, but it just is a very good book, and it covers, how can Islam answer atheism? And he talks about everything to do with epistemology, how we know anything. It talks about God's existence, it talks about science, it talks about theodicy, the problem of evil. And towards the end, Islam and science, he talks about a kind of miscellany. He talks about problems that atheists see in Sharia, in jihad, slavery. He talks about corporal punishment, capital punishment for apostates, homosexuality in Islam, the marriage of Lady Aisha, polygamy, the hijab, wife beating, women's intellect and leadership. I've looked at these chapters and these sections, and they're really very well written, and they're mainstream, moderate, sensible, but orthodox responses. So this is a very useful resource if you want a good understanding of what atheist arguments are, what fallacies they contain, and how a Muslim might respond to them. So that's that book. I recommend that. So what else? I think that's probably enough for now. So that's 21 minutes. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of books one could recommend. So we need a good translation of the Bible, the NRSV, some good introductions to Hadith, the life of Muhammad, from very distinguished Western historians using the latest scholarship, clearly showing that Muhammad is a prophet of peace and tolerance. We need good introductions to Judaism by Jews themselves, the Jewish Study Bible, the Talmud, history of Judaism, and we need good introductions to the New Testament. Bar Ehrman and John Barton as well have written some very highly regarded texts. So that's probably it for now. Hope that was of interest. Till next time.